Our next session of Lightning Talks was, of course, inspired by the now ubiquitous TED Talks. We invited some of the leading thinkers and doers who will inspire us to think differently after they've given their presentations. Unlike TED, where I don't think you can ask questions of the presenters after they speak, we will provide you an opportunity to ask questions of our lightning speakers, and they will also be joined by Fikri, who is our fantastic speaker this morning. And my colleague Elise Young will moderate the question and answer period for our lightning speakers. Our first speaker is Judithe Registre, whose clarity around the need for pursuing gender equality in an education space may make you think differently about how we conceive of girls' education. Judithe?
Well, I don't know if I'm going to do that, but we'll soon find out. I'm told this is apparently an experiment. They didn't do this last year, so the three of us are this year's experiment. So we'll see how it works. I want to start this conversation by telling you a little briefly about my own journey to gender and development work. I studied philosophy, and for a third culture child of an immigrant family, it was kind of an odd thing to study philosophy, but I was always interested in human nature, social systems, social structures. So I did my undergrad in philosophy, my graduate study in philosophy, and what I wanted to do was travel and see the world. And I couldn't figure out what to do with that journey. And then as I went through the whole process, like most philosophers do, you think through your life and where you want to go. It became very clear to me that I had a real interest in society and then interest in children. So I thought I could do work with children. Through the process, it became very clear to me that if you really want to work with children, you needed to work with their mothers. So my journey through gender work started out primarily with women, with an interest in working, because I was interested in the vulnerability of children. How do we actually improve the next generation? And if you actually provide the right resources to children, they actually can change the circumstances of their lives. So it was kind of like there are two groups of population that have interest to me. Children, because whatever you do and say to them matters. And the elderly, because whatever they say and do matters, because they've lived, they've experienced, they have a wisdom and perspective that we can all benefit from. So when I started my work in women's work, it was quite an interesting phenomenon. We were calling it gender, but the reality, it was actually working on women. And I think part of the transition I've seen in the sector, which has been exciting for me, is the movement that we are moving, not just focusing on women, but looking at what does gender work mean. So I did my work on gender, and through the process working with women, it was like, wow, this was amazing. But if only we caught up those women earlier in the conversation, like when we wait for women to become women to address gender equality, it is much too late. I will say that again. If we wait for women to become women to address gender equality, it is much too late. It's going to take a long journey, and we'll spend a lot of resources doing that. So throughout this whole process, like the philosopher I am, always thinking, what's the next step? How do I make my contribution to humanity? It became very clear to me, and it was about the same time, sort of like I would say the last 5-7 years, the transition in gender work and women's work have actually increased in women's and girls' education. So I got really engaged in the girls' education movement and conversation and work in particular. What became very clear to me through that conversation and engagement is not only is it challenging, but we actually also are challenged by our approach and strategy. It's important for us for girls to stay in school. And we spend a lot of resources, and I think the data has made it clear that the increase in girls' education has been transformative. More girls are in school today than there were 10 years ago. That is a progress, and that's what we should all celebrate right here, because we all had a lot to do with that work. But families and communities had a lot to do with the desire they had for their children to go to school. Now, I think the conversation have been very interesting to the extent that I think when the economists and the World Bank came out with the data in terms of understanding the investment in women, what that means for economic development, the discourse around girls' education have been essentially focused around what I think is very important for the conversation, the economic value of girls to the society. The inherent value of girls in and of themselves as human beings worthy of an education, we still have a lot of work to do in that category. And so my journey has been not only trying to understand what's the movement and the trend we need to actually make to say, yeah, the economic piece is great, but that same economic argument for society has also been somewhat the argument why we needed girls to get married early. And so how do we actually stay focused within our conversation, within the context with communities and girls themselves about what's the transition that needs to go? Now, a lot of girls, we talk about forced and early marriage as a key challenge to girls' education. This is where, for me, the conversation comes beyond girls' education to the actual gender discussion. And my point I'm about to talk about is not so much about forced marriage. It's about early marriage and marriage pregnancy that leads to marriage. A lot of girls are forced to drop out of school due to early pregnancy. Now, and a lot of programs are designed to address child marriage around this particular question around education. And what we found with our work at Plant, particularly on this particular issue, one example in Indonesia, we had a program that was targeting early marriage. Gone through the program and through engagement with the community, what we found was actually the girls were getting pregnant early. And they were getting pregnant by other young men around the same age, but they were forced to drop out of school. That meant the boys continued to go to school while the girls had to drop out. So what was the problem, and why am I telling you this point? Our program was designed around child marriage, when what we actually needed was actual sexual reproductive health education. So we had to totally redesign, but sexual reproductive health education, not for the whole purpose of targeting girls in and of themselves. What we learned through the process was that the boys themselves, they had concern around their bodies were going through changes. And what's been fascinating to me in my work with boys and young people, adolescent youth, has been the ability and the desire to change. And I think that's an opportunity we need to grab hold on. And this goes back to the point for me earlier, even investing in men, while I think it's an important conversation, I think boys are actually where the opportunities are. So as we think about what's the next step and how do we approach girls' education in a way that's really transformative, for me, the transformation is around where do we move from point A to point B, around looking at not girls' education in and of itself for the economic value, while that's key and critically important, but how do we look at girls' education as a value for her own human rights, as the ambassador was talking about earlier? And also, how do we actually address the issue of gender equality, including men? And I think for me, the challenge in the conversation has been, when we talk about including men and boys, it's been either men as perpetrators, we need to understand the issues, or men as savior. And I think there's an opportunity in between where we need to actually move away from engaging men as savior or perpetrators and boys, but as agent of change, because one of the things we found in the work that we've done, more boys miss school due to violence than girls. The data around what boys experience and how it impacts violence in school is something we need to get more information, because it impacts girls inherently. And so as I close with these couple of points, that the opportunities have never been brighter for us. But I think where the opportunities are is really to tap into the resources and the insight and energy that boys have. And I'll close with this very brief story from a young boy in El Salvador. We were talking about violence against girls in school. And he was saying, we experience violence too. And on some level, no one is paying attention to us. And we have a desire to actually redefine who we want to become as men, as boys. But we don't have an alternative. The example we have are what's presented to us. And yeah, we are struggling to redefine what it means to be a man, to protect and support girls. As they get their education, we get an education. So I think as you think about going forward your own work, think about what do we mean by gender equality within the context of girls' education? And what does it mean with the experience of boys? And I think we have a moral imperative to begin to actually collect data to understand what's happening with boys within the context of education and how it impacts our own effort for girls' education. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judithe. That was great. Our second speaker came all the way from India to present some very interesting work that FHI 360 is doing on mitigating migrant vulnerability in HIV/AIDS. I'd like to introduce to you Sumita Taneja.
Good afternoon. I'm Sumita from India. This is my first time at an international summit, and this is my first time as a speaker, so I'm nervous as hell. I wasn't expecting such a large... Thank you for the encouragement. If a summit like this was to happen in India, I was expecting probably half the participants to slip away after lunch. But I see a full house here. And what's interesting is to see that the hall is packed with much more women than I was expecting. So clearly, the issues we've been talking about, male engagement and involvement on gender, is right here, evident, and so palpable. I'm going to talk about our work in India on addressing gender vulnerabilities in the context of HIV and migration. I'm going to start with a story of Lichman Devi. She was one of our participants in the gender vulnerability and needs analysis that we did in a state of Bihar, which is a very high out migration state in India. She was one of the participants in the FGDs that we were conducting with young women. Lichman narrated her personal story and told us how she was pregnant with her first child when she was 19. As part of the routine ANC package of services, she was tested for HIV in the local primary health center in the village, and she was tested positive for HIV. She didn't know what that meant. Lichman is married to Ramesh, who's 10 years older than her, and a migrant worker who works in Mumbai, which is a high HIV prevalence in migration, urban metropolitan city. As part of the partner notification program, Ramesh was also called in for HIV testing at the center, and he too tested positive for HIV. And that was the turning point in Lichman's life. She was thrown out of the village by her husband and her in-laws. She was threatened never to return. What was fortunate for Lichman was that her parents, in spite of abject poverty and the fear of bringing back a married young girl home, and the fear of stigma, not so much of HIV, but more to really bring a married young girl back home, brought Lichman back. So this is the story of most young married women living with HIV in India. Most of you may know that India is a low HIV prevalence setting, where we have a HIV prevalence of 0.3%. But we are also the second largest and most populated country in the world, with a population of 1.3 billion people. So when the 0.3% of HIV prevalence translates into absolute numbers, it's almost 2.1 million people living with HIV. And 39% of this population segment is women. And the biggest risk for women in India who are living with HIV is their marital status. So most women get the infection by virtue of being married. The response to HIV in India is almost 2 decades or more old. And like in any other low prevalence HIV setting, the focus of the national program so far has been on high-risk population groups, what we call key populations. It was in 2011 and 12 that there was some new body of evidence that was presented before the government of India that forced them to start looking at migration and migrants as a vulnerable category for intervention. What was interesting was that there were these pockets of ANC sites in high out migration states, which had surprisingly started showing increasing trends of HIV among ANC clinic attendees. And on the other hand, there were these high in-migration urban metro cities where young men who were walking in for HIV testing and were found to be HIV positive. There was this source-destination corridor link that the government was able to identify. It was in 2012, finally, that the national government drafted a national source migration strategy, which began to prioritize looking at not just male migrants at destination sites, but also young boys who are potential migrants and spouses of migrants who are left behind in the villages and who are vulnerable to HIV. So where did FHI come into this whole scene? We had just, a couple of us from the India office had just completed a gender training which headquarters and the regional office had conducted in 2012. And we were very excited and full of passion to take up some interesting work around gender in India. And we wrote a very interesting project proposal for the Gender Challenge Fund, which we won in 2012. So this was the first dedicated pot of funding, very small funding, but dedicated funding for gender that was awarded to FHI in India in 2012. And we wanted to do meaningful work, which contributed to some interesting work around gender vulnerability in India. The donor positioned FHI well with the national government. And the first thing we did was really support the national government in really doing a deep dive into understanding the gender vulnerabilities linked to HIV and migration. What was interesting to note was that there were three distinct population segments that needed attention. One were these young boys, as young as 19 to 22 years in a state like Bihar, who often drop out of school at the secondary level, and they're the ones who are drawn towards urban cities on account of a pull factor to come in search of jobs and to earn money for their families, which live in abject poverty. The second are these migrants who live in metro cities, work long hours, live in shanties in very poor working conditions and living conditions. And they return back home roughly twice a year for a period of 15 to 30 days with a very limited period of cohabitation with their married partners and wives. And there is a huge element of risk in terms of unsafe sexual behaviors and practices when it comes to this whole dynamics of young boys migrating to urban areas, being drawn towards experimental sex, buying commercial sex, not really having the right or complete or accurate knowledge about condom use. On the other hand, we have men who return back home for short periods and spells of time and shoulder the norms of masculinity, where they need to leave their wives pregnant when they go back, so that when they come back, they have a male child who welcomes them and the family celebrates their return. And third most vulnerable population segments that we came across were the spouses themselves. These are young girls as young as 15 to 20, 22 years old, who soon after marriage are left behind with their in-laws. They often get pregnant early. Their overall knowledge about HIV is very low. Their self-risk perception to HIV is very low. They do not correlate marriage to high risk of HIV and infection. Their own life skills to even seek basic health services, forget about HIV services, is very, very low. And their ability to negotiate condom use on account of very, very poor interspousal communication relationships and unequal power dynamics that operate in a married couple's life in India further adds to their vulnerabilities. So in the current context of migration and the patterns of migration and the risk and vulnerability and the shifting patterns of HIV in the country, we realize that any response to HIV in migration is very complex and not easy because it covers multiple subpopulations which cut across different age groups, young boys, young girls, young married men and women, older married men and women who are the in-laws, and the larger community on the one hand. And we also realize that the geographies are so widespread. So there are interventions required at source, there are interventions required at destination, possibly some at even transit. So what we are supporting with the Government of India currently is through the gender vulnerability assessments that we've conducted, we are trying to help the government to really look at the national response, to address the deep-rooted gender vulnerabilities, and to prepare young boys for safe migration, to help migrant men to start understanding the importance of condom use, not just in commercial sex, but also when they return back home to their wives. And we are helping the government to look at spouses of migrants, to prepare them for better life skills so that they are also able to understand and perceive self-risk. And last but not the least, it's the women and men who are already infected with HIV. Like Lichman, how do we make sure that they don't fall through the cracks? They are linked not just to the whole range of HIV treatment and testing services, but also more importantly to the larger social protection, livelihood services so that they can live life of dignity and hope. It's a lot of more work. We've just begun last year. The work primarily has been more diagnostic in terms of really coming up with the findings from the gender analysis and vulnerability analysis that we've been doing. But we are fortunate that the donor, CDC, has positioned the FHI very strategically at the national level as a technical assistance partner. And that's been extremely helpful because the technical assistance is valued at the national level, and we hope that in a low resource and a resource constrained setting like India, the work that we do would have a long-term sustainable impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumita. You did a great job. Our last lightning talk will be given by a woman who has completely dedicated her life to eradicating gender-based violence, and who's actually recently given a TED Talk for Ted DuPont Circle. I'd like to introduce Mary Ellsberg from George Washington University.
Having just given the most terrifying talk in my life at TED Talk, I'm having a little bit of flashbacks here right now. Fortunately, at least here, they allow you to carry notes with you, so that's something. So I'm meant to give a lightning talk, which I take to mean that I should speak at lightning speed on recent breakthroughs around policy practice and research on gender-based violence. And I have to say that I really think with Laurie Michaud's talk in the morning and Ambassador Russell's remarks today, I think both the policy and the program side have really been very well covered. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the research side, which is the side that I know best anyway. And a lot of what I'm talking about is actually summarized in a recent issue of The Lancet that Laurie also had a great article in. And there's a call to action, which many organizations have signed on to, and I encourage you to download it and read it. So I'd like to go back 20 years to Beijing. Ambassador Russell talked about it. We've mentioned it several times today. And just remember what we knew about violence against women at the time, which was very little. We knew that it existed, but we didn't know how much, and we didn't know the best ways to address it. And in fact, the call from Beijing was actually the main call was not to reduce violence, it was actually to get more evidence on the prevalence, the causes, and the consequences of violence against women. So just this last few months ago at CSW, I thought it was interesting that people kept saying, well, we really we haven't achieved anything. 1 in 3 women has been abused in their lifetime. What's happened in 20 years? Well, actually, that's kind of bearing the lead, because 20 years ago, we didn't know that 1 out of 3 women had been abused. So I think that's something actually worth celebrating, and it is the product of years and years of hard work on the part of many activists and researchers. So where we do know, and also I just wanted to say something about the idea of making the case and the importance of it. I think it's true that we've done pretty well in making the case there, but if we hadn't, we would not be talking about having an indicator or a target around violence against women right now in the Sustainable Development Goals. When the Millennium Development Goals were being discussed, we discussed having a target or an indicator on violence, and we didn't have enough information either to show that it was a problem or to be able to measure any changes or trends across countries. So again, I feel like this is something that we really need to be celebrating, the information that we have. And as a result, largely, of this, we have now laws and national policies all over the world. Over 100 countries now have national laws on domestic violence. Most countries have some kind of national commission or national plan on violence against women. So we've clearly changed the public discourse. We have made the case at that level. But how does that translate into reality? Can we really say that women on the ground are safer than they were 20 years ago? Can we say that when they have been abused, they are more likely to be able to go to a police and have compassionate care, that there will be justice for, and perpetrators will be held accountable, that they will have high quality, compassionate, comprehensive services? Yes, in little pockets, but to a very large degree, I would say we don't have much evidence that things are really much better on the ground. I think there's a lot of reasons for that, and it reminds us that we need much more investment and we need more accountability. And that's again why I return to the importance of indicators and continuing to gather evidence so that we can hold states accountable. Now, we still have gaps in our knowledge, and there are 2 areas that I think are really important. One has to do more with the causes and the risk factors of violence against women, and the other one is what works primarily, especially to prevent violence against women and girls. And I just want to call your attention to an article that Lori Heisey just published in The Lancet Global Health 2 weeks ago that I consider a huge breakthrough, and many of us who know her work have been really excited waiting for this paper to come out. Everybody has heard about the ecological framework and the way that Lori Heisey applies it to understanding violence against women, right? And several people have referred to it today here. Well, now she's used a huge data set of almost 500,000 women from 44 different countries, where she's looked at the prevalence of violence in all these different countries and how do those measure up compared to women's socioeconomic status, to GDP, to education, to property laws, to social norms, a whole variety of social indicators. And trying to explain why the prevalence varies so much between countries and even sometimes within countries between settings, and what can account for that. And up to now, we've had a lot of ideas. It might just be, it's women's economic status, it's education. We have lots of ideas also about what is the way to end violence against women. And what Lori found out is, in some ways, not too surprising, but I think it's really significant. When accounting for all the possible different indicators, including GDP and education, she found 2 factors that really did explain the variation among countries in the prevalence of violence. And one of them was access to property and to land and to assets. And the other one was social norms. And very specifically, countries where both men and women feel that men have a right to beat women if they misbehave in certain ways, or transgress gender norms, and that men have a right to control women's bodies. These were the 2 norms that most accurately predicted whether an individual woman would be abused, or whether in a country women would have a greater risk of being abused than others. And issues such as GDP actually fell through once you were controlling. They were not determinant. That's incredibly important and significant, and we really need to really keep that in mind. And I think it just fits in really so well with what Lori was just saying, because that's been the finding on the ground, that the way to get people behaving differently and acting differently at a community level is by working on social norms and specifically talking about power, talking in a positive sort of way. And so I think that what's really exciting is that we're seeing both on the ground from the SASA evaluations and a few others like them, and Lori's macro information, that really the way to move the needle is by working at all of these different levels. Now, of course, means that's very challenging. And how do we do that is a very good question. How do we do that? One thing that I also wanted to say about these laws is just remind us that the laws didn't happen by accident. And another really interesting piece of research came out a year or two ago saying that the countries that have the laws, or the greatest predictor of whether a country has a strong law on domestic violence, is whether it has a strong women's movement. So again, and I heard Ambassador Russell talking about civil society. We need, 2 minutes? Okay, here we go. We need to make sure as we mainstream these issues and as they get onto the international agenda that women's movements don't get sidelined and that they remain, we owe where we are right now to the women's movement. And we need to be able to, keep that present and make sure that they continue to be very strong voices at the table. So I'll get to the last point. I recently read that the #1 way to look smart in a meeting is to ask, does it scale? So I'm trying it out here. How do we scale up? And see, it worked. There's 2 things I wanted to say about that. One is, we know now that standalone projects on violence against women, they're not cost effective, they're not effective overall. So one area that we're doing a lot more work in is looking at existing development platforms and addressing gender-based violence in all of those areas. So if we want to have a successful education program or a health program or microfinance, 31 minute. Okay, almost there. We're on the countdown now. We need to be integrating work on gender-based violence in all of those areas, just the way we do when we talk about gender mainstreaming. And the other part of it that's hard is that Lori said that there's no cookie-cutter approach. You can't just replicate social change from one village to another. It has to happen organically. It has to make sense. So I'm really excited to be hearing, for example, as SASA gets adapted to a lot of different places, I think there will be a huge amount of learning about how that gets done and how things do scale. And my last point in my last 30 seconds is again about learning and how important it is that we continue to talk to each other, activists with researchers, with policymakers, and we do too little of that. And not only that, but we also are really siloed in the different groups that work on different forms of violence against women. So here we have the FGMC guys, and over there we have the child marriage guys, and the IPV maybe are sitting in the middle, and we've got the sexual assault people. And there's not that much conversation between us, and we act as though these are completely different things, when everything we're learning about this shows that the roots of all these different forms of violence against women and girls are the same, and the solutions are also very similar. So I really invite us to keep that idea present, and I look forward to continuing to talk with all of you about this. Thank you. Oh, nice. Okay. So now we're staying.
Mary, is this on? Okay. Well, again, I'm Elise Young, and I'm going to be your moderator for question and answer time. I think that with the great depth of expertise on the stage, we'll have a lot to talk about. We'll take 3 questions at a time And please indicate if there's a specific person versus everyone that you'd like that directed towards, and I'll help navigate. So, first questions.
You have someone over there.
All right. Yes. Hold on just 1 second. Let's get you a mic.
Thank you. I'm Insha. And as a continuing student of communications, I have this one question, especially for Judith, because of your work with young people. And I was wondering, is there a communications strategy or around messaging and the best medium of communicating with young people that you have worked on? And I'm asking this because I just came across a study whereby they said that the emotional side of the brain in a young person, in a teenager, is very well developed compared to the frontal lobe, which is the rationality part. And so when we are communicating with young people, do we keep that in mind, and do our communications and our messaging take this into account? So yeah, and thoughts from the other panelists on the same would be appreciated.
All right, great.
Well,
why don't we just take two more, unless we don't have an overwhelm, and then we'll come back to that one, but I'll be sure to remember. Another question? Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Amara Chinakronye. Thank you so much, all of you, for all of your commentary, and it's been a wonderful morning and afternoon of hearing all these different perspectives in regards to thinking more holistically about gender inequalities and the best ways to tackle this huge issue. So we've had a lot of discussion about how women perpetuate gender inequalities, but also how men perpetuate gender inequalities. But moving beyond that binary, even though it is very significant, but moving beyond that binary, I just wanted to get further insight on your opinions about how we can target families, because gender socialization begins within the home, within the domestic sphere. So I'm just curious, how do we engage mothers, fathers, and going even further when you're thinking about sub-Saharan Africa or India with extended families, and how we can go further in targeting the family and changing those ideologies in regards to gender socialization. Thank you.
It's a great question. Okay. Meg. I think you might need to switch it on at the bottom until there's a green light.
Hello? Yes. Good. Hello. I'm Meg Green. I wanted to get back to something that Fikri was speaking about earlier, which was the questioning of his very manhood for joining the fight for gender equality, and that immediately to me raised the issue of homophobia, which we haven't really talked about much today. And I wondered if you or other members of the panel could speak to that issue. You know, what can we do about that when the men in particular are there's sort of seen almost understood as a conflict of interest for them to join the women's movement and the gender equality movement.
Great. All right, let's take those. So we have communication strategies for young people, how to target families, especially extended families, and questioning of manhood and related homophobia. So Judithe, would you like to address the first one?
Yes. To your question, at Plan we have a very strong child protection program initiative. So our program, the way everything is designed, we have child protection policy that everything that's followed in terms of communication with children, how we design program. But I think more fundamentally beyond this policy is that our initiative, our program are driven by the young people. I mean, we have, even on our board, youth. So it's a very, I think Plan is actually quite advanced in the way that it looks at and work with children. It's not, like we adults, we know, and then we're gonna actually give you the way. We actually respond to what the youth are saying, which is why even at our national board, we have young people on the board. So I think that's quite a unique model beyond the communication stand to actually take a cue from the young people we serve, as well as the community we serve. So that's the first quick point to your question. To the question on the, beyond the binary conversation, I think for me and for the work I've been involved in, the organization I've been involved in, while we actually address it within a binary context, there's a strong strategy to look at the structural issues. And I think very often we talk about, the issue as if, one is sort of victim, others are power. I think in so many ways we are all victims of our cultures, so I don't think there is, some benefits more than others.